We're talking today with Dr. Gary Doublestein of Spring Lake, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Gary, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born November 15th, the first day of deer season in 1952 in Plainwell, Michigan. I grew up on a farm in Wayland, Michigan, near Gun Lake, and and that's where I went through high school. I never moved from there.
Okay. Now, while you're in high school, now we're talking in the mid-60s and so forth, the Vietnam War is going on, how much were you aware of the war and the draft and all of that?
Back then it seemed like everybody was very aware of the draft, and everybody was very aware of the war. I was torn from the standpoint that I wanted to serve my country. I had always wanted to be in the Navy because my father was in the Navy. I always thought it was the most romantic thing in the world to be able to go on board ship. But the other thing is I really didn't want to kill anybody. I went, so when I did decide to go in, I decided to go in as a hospital corpsman. As a matter of fact, it's kind of funny, when I was recruited, you know, the chief came over to my home, and he asked, he says, "Well, son, what do you want to do when you come into the Navy?" I says, "Well, I want to be a hospital corpsman." And right away he says, "No, you don't." I says, "Well, yeah, I do." He says, "No, you don't." My mother's sitting right there, and I was only 17 years old, so I had to make, you know, she had to sign for me.
Mm-hmm.
So she looks at the chief and says, "Why doesn't he want to be a hospital corpsman?" Says, "Because they're dropping like flies in Vietnam. He's going to be sent with the Marines, and they're going to kill him." And so my mother looks at me, says, and then looks at him and says, "I'm not signing for you to go if you're going to go as a hospital corpsman." What was I to do? You know, I said to her, "Okay, well, I'll go in as an aviation recruit then. You know, my second choice is to fix airplanes." And believe me, you wouldn't want to fly in an airplane that I fixed, honest truly. But, so, she signed as long as I went in as an aviation recruit. When I got to boot camp, after the first 7 weeks of boot camp, they had an aptitude day, and you took all the tests. And afterwards, each person got counseled, and you know, the guy says, "You know, Doublestein, you did really good on everything. You can do just about anything you want to do. What is it that you want to do?" He says, "Is it too late to be a hospital corpsman?" And he says, "Oh no, son, come right over here." And so, much to my mother's chagrin, I got what I wanted anyway.
All right. Now, by the time, were you still 17 at that point?
I was still 17 at that.
So when was it exactly then that you started boot camp?
At 17.
Okay, what year?
1970. I left, I graduated from high school, you know, something like June 6th, and 2 weeks later I was on my way to boot camp. You know, got my first airplane ride. It was pretty neat. You know.
Okay. Where did you go for boot camp?
I went to San Diego. When you joined the service at that time, everybody went, in this area anyway, went over to Detroit, to AFES. And they did all this physical, you know, the physical on you. You're walking around in your underwear everywhere. And then you have, at the end, they ask you, I could have gone to Great Lakes, which is in Chicago, or I could have gone to San Diego. And I kind of asked the guy, I says, "Well, how do I get to San Diego?" And he says, "Well, we fly you, of course." I says, I had never been on an airplane. He says, "Well, I want to go to San Diego." You know, so that was my first airplane ride. But yeah, that's where
Okay, and to back up to going to Detroit for the physical, there's a lot of stories or things that show up in movies about people trying to scam the system in different ways or get out of it. Did you see any of that?
Oh, a lot of that. A lot of that. Some of the guys were just tickled to death when they got a 4F, you know. They would fake all kinds of stuff. To me, it would have been the biggest blow to my existence in the world if anything had happened to keep me from joining the Navy, because essentially that's what I wanted to do most of my life. You know, and like I said, because my father, I knew I couldn't afford to go to college. I knew my parents couldn't afford to send me to college. And I also had the wherewithal to actually know that I was kind of a screwball in high school, and I would have been a screwball in college at that time too. So the Navy was my way, was going to kill two birds with one stone. Number one, I was going to have the adventure of my life. Number two, I was going to have college paid for when it was all done. Mm-hmm. So, and hopefully, number three, I would be a little bit more mature at that time.
Right.
So it totally worked out.
Okay. Talk about the boot camp experience. What do they do with you there?
Oh my. Well, from the time you got off the bus, you flew into San Diego, and then they picked you up in a bus, and they were actually quite nice to you when you got on the bus. But immediately after they opened the doors, when you were at Naval Training Center there at San Diego, some words I hadn't even heard before. I was being called every name under the book, in the book rather, and so was everybody else. I felt kind of comforted that I wasn't the only one, but you were supposed to run here, run there, run there. It was just a mass confusion for everybody, but they had you, they wanted you to know that you were in their control from the minute you stepped off that bus. The next day, I mean, they threw you, in a transient rack, so you get a little bit of sleep, but I think they gave you about 3 hours sleep, and then they got you up the next morning. You had to go and get your hair buzzed, get uniforms issued, get yelled at quite a bit more, learn that which was your left and which was your right foot. It was just, I think the entire thing about boot camp was to break, tear you down. Mm-hmm. And then the second part of boot camp, they started to build you up again. The first 7 weeks, and there was actually a bridge that you moved at the Naval Training Center. You stayed in this part of the NTC the first 7 weeks. And after that 7 weeks, the whole company crossed this bridge into another area, and you moved your barracks and everything. So it was almost like a transition. I did get away with a few things, though.
Okay. Well, how long was the second part?
It was another 7 weeks.
Okay, so 14 weeks total then between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, what are they actually training you in those first 7 weeks?
Basically, it's marching. I mean, it's, and they introduce you to, I think the second 7 weeks they introduced you to, actually shooting a pistol and shooting a rifle and things like that. Although in the Navy you don't do a lot of that. But first 7 weeks, knot tying, Navy history, the rules, the Blue Jackets manual, things like that, and how much trouble you can get in for this and this and this, and they want you to know in no uncertain terms that they're watching you, they want, ready to pounce on you.
Okay. Now they do stuff with telling you how to make your bed and keep your
absolutely.
stuff, all that kind of thing.
Sure, yeah, and I'm sure most people who've been in the military, I think it happens in all branches of the military. They show you how to fold your socks, how to fold your underwear, certainly, fold this, fold that, and then they have a total sea bag inspection that you're supposed to put on your bed, put everything in a certain way, and of course, the drill instructor comes through and just tears everything totally apart, throws it all over the place, and then you've got 15 minutes to clean it up or something like that. I think that happens in all of the services. Yes.
All right. Now, did you at the time understand what they were doing?
No, I didn't have any preordained concept of what was going to happen. I knew that boot camp was going to be tough, and my dad told me boot camp was going to be tough, and everybody that I had ever seen that had been in the military told me boot camp was tough. and to just kind of go with the flow, and that's exactly what I did.
Okay.
Except for one time.
And what was that?
Oh, I got away with something. I was in this first 7 weeks. All of a sudden, I get a call to go to the chaplain's office. Now, nobody questions the chaplain's office. So I had to march clear across over here to the chaplain's office, and I had to have two guys escort me from my company. So I get to the steps of the chaplain's office, and the chaplain steps outside, and he says, you other two guys, go back to your unit. This is going to take a while. And I'm thinking, whoa, what's going on here? Well, my brother had been in the Navy at the same time, and he was in sonar tech school in San Diego. The chaplain escorts me in, and here's my brother, there, and I says, and he says, you guys, this counseling session is going to take about 4 hours. I don't want to see you for the next 4 hours. So I go over to his barracks, put on one of his uniforms, and we go bobbing downtown San Diego for about 4 hours. And this is when I was still a burrhead, no hair or anything like that. And then we got back, and nobody ever found out that I had done that. So it was kind of cool.
I'm sure it was authorized because, of course, the chaplain.
Well, nobody questions the chaplain.
Right.
Just kind of almost like being a doctor, and nobody really questions him either.
All right. Now, you said that then when you went over to the second part of boot camp, then things changed. How was that different?
Well, there you were starting to be introduced into all the types of things that you could be doing. They would talk to you a little bit more reasonably. Actually, the last 2 weeks you could actually get a little liberty, meaning you could go off base and for a few hours here and there. So they started, and also you started learning that your unit is much more important than you are, and that's where you get, like here, you're nothing. You found out that you're nothing. Here, you found out you're part of a unit, and from that perspective, you are important.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I actually spent 2 extra weeks I actually spent 9 weeks in boot camp in this part, mainly because I joined the Blue Jackets Choir. I had to audition for it, and I got it, and of course they promised me that if I spent those extra 2 weeks, I'd get more liberty, during that time. That never happened, by the way. But as part of the Blue Jackets Choir in that last nine weeks, we were able to go off base. We sang for certain events. We sang everywhere we went while we were marching. Kind of like the drum and bugle corps did the same thing with her. So we, as a matter of fact, I became the admiral of the Blue Jackets Choir my last week that I was there. But it was kind of a good experience. But you didn't do anything less than what everybody else was doing. You just did this extra thing.
Okay. All right. Now, once you finish up then with boot camp, now what happens to you?
Well, then you go to. Then I went to Hospital Corps School. And that was in San Diego also, and that was Balboa Naval Hospital. And that was a 14-week course, teaching you the basics and beyond of first aid. It's kind of like, I'm trying to think, you have the basic EMT and then the one above that, and I'm blanking on what that would be, but it gets you to that level. Because most hospital corpsmen, either with Marines or on smaller ships, are independent duty.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to learn how to do a lot of things that just basic stuff wasn't enough. So we trained a lot on the suturing, things like that, which I got a lot more experience once I went to Camp Pendleton on that. So that's what we did.
Okay. And how long did Corps School last?
14 weeks.
Okay. And then, what is your first assignment from there?
Well, I requested someplace in Maine, I requested several things on the east coast of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And as a third choice, I said anything east of the Mississippi. Well, they sent me 10 miles up the coast to Camp Pendleton, California, which turned out to be the best thing that ever happened in my life. But, at the time I was kind of bummed out. But, so we went to I was at Camp Pendleton. I was first attached to the Camp Pendleton Naval Hospital.
Okay.
And that's where I met my wife, I had been there for about a year, not a year, about 6 months. And all of a sudden this brand new Navy nurse comes on board. She was just got there,
Mm-hmm.
An ensign, and she was coming on my floor. I was on the surgical floor. I thought to myself right then and there, this is the girl I'm going to marry. And let me tell you, I asked her later on whether she felt the same way. She says, well, no, really, not really. She says, I thought you might be a good friend, but I don't think that you're, I really didn't think you were somebody I wanted to marry at that time. Anyway.
Now, weren't there like rules? Because
Yeah.
you're enlisted and she's an officer.
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
Yep.
Continue that.
Well, we worked together for a while, but I also noticed that a lot of the hospital foremen and the Navy nurses were dating.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I says, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to have to do this now. So it took me a long time to get out the actual words, to actually ask. Essentially what was going to happen is a friend of mine had a girlfriend already, and he was a hospital corpsman and she was a Navy nurse.
Mm-hmm.
And he lived in California, and they were going to go out to dinner up by Whittier. And, I says, he's invited me to go along with him. Would you like to go? So I figured, double date, safe. Now, much to my surprise, she said yes. Well, a day later, I says, well, I had that much luck. Let's try just a little bit more. So I asked her if she could, maybe if we could maybe get together before that, like go to McDonald's or something. I had to borrow somebody's car to do that. And she said yes again. And so I go and pick her up, and her and her roommate were having hamburgers over there with a bunch of people, so that's where we stayed. And that's how we got to know each other real well. But then we dated for 3 months. I got orders to go then to Vietnam, on board the Kitty Hawk. And I decided, I did not want to go to sea without experiencing marital bliss. And so, I asked her to marry me. And she said, yeah, let's do that. Well, once again, my age had a lot to do with this. I was only 19 at that time. She was 21. But once again, I had to have my mother's permission to do this. I call her up, I call my mother up, I says, Linda and I are going to get married. First words out of my mother's mouth, she's pregnant, isn't she? I said, no, she's not. It's just that I got these orders, and I wanted, and we're absolutely convinced that this is what we want. Once again, she says, she's pregnant, isn't she? I says, no, she's not. She says, don't you lie to me. I said, I'm not lying to you. I says, look, Mom, either you sign this, or I can go up to Reno. I can go over across the state line, and I can do this without your permission. Well, at that point, my mother hangs up on me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought I was going to have to. We were making plans to go to Reno, and so then my dad calls back. He says, well, I've talked to your mom. You've made a lot of decisions in your life that, for your age, have tended to work out. And if this is what you really think you want to do, then we'll go ahead and sign. So we got married in Whittier, California at this friend's place. Neither her parents or my parents were there. We hadn't even met each other's parents before we got married. And then we had some vacation time and went and saw them.
Okay.
But, I think the reason that I got the orders, is my strong suspicion that I got the orders to Vietnam, was the fact that there was fraternizing going on. As a matter of fact, when she asked her immediate supervisor if they had to ask for permission to get married too from their immediate supervisor, and the immediate supervisor said some things that have always stuck with me and has been a motivating factor in most of my life. Says, he's enlisted. Do you really think he's good enough for you?
Mm-hmm.
So I've spent the rest of my life trying to be good enough for her. So.
Yeah.
And we're still married.
And you're still married, so
Yes.
it's okay. But now let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about the time you spent at Camp Pendleton. Because how long were you there on that job?
I was there for about a year and a half.
Okay. What did your duties consist of?
Well, the first part was at Camp Pendleton. I was in charge of the surgery, or not in charge of. I worked on the surgery floor, doing post-op, care, and actually I taught my wife how to do the first intravenous catheter, and that was brand new at that time, but so basically it was that, and every once in a while I had to stand duty in the ER, which I got a lot of chance to do. Marines are crazy. They go and do things to each other, and you have to sew them up all the time. So I got a lot of suturing experience there. Then I was attached to the 1st FSR, and basically I manned a clinic.
Okay.
And most of the time...
And what does 1st FSR stand for?
1st Fleet Service Regiment.
Okay.
And I had a clinic out on Camp Pendleton, that I kind of manned most of the time myself. There was a dock there, but you'd come in and out, but the docks never stayed there at night. And if they did, we did everything at night, because the docks really didn't want to get up, So, it was kind of getting an experience of independent duty. Never had to, and when I got the orders then thereafter, I thought sure that I was going to go to Vietnam with the Marines at that point, because I was already there. I was already with them. All it would have taken was a little more training with, field med, but no, it was to the Kitty Hawk.
Okay. All right. And so, for people who don't know, what kind of ship is a Kitty Hawk?
Kitty Hawk is an aircraft carrier. It was the last of the, I believe it was called the Forrestal class. And it was just retired here, I think about 5 years ago in Japan. But it was conventional powered aircraft carrier. It had 100 airplanes, 5,500 people, essentially a great big floating city. But I was, on the other hand, I was kind of excited about going on board the ship because I'd always wanted to go aboard ship. It wasn't until I got aboard ship that I figured, I found out my life had been a waste at that point, because it's really not there's nothing romantic about it at all. It's just, it's noisy, smelly, hot, humid, and tedious, for the most part.
All right.
Except when things happen.
Okay. So where did you join the ship?
I joined the ship in the Philippines.
Okay.
And I flew from San Francisco to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, and then took a bus to Subic. And there I had to wait there for a couple of weeks to, but then actually the ship didn't come in. I took another ship, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was a helicopter carrier. I got on board that ship to go out to where the Kitty Hawk was, and then they helicoptered me over onto the flight net.
Okay. So how did you spend your time in Subic Bay?
Trying to figure out how to get cool. It was hot and humid. I know, I never went I never went over to Longapo City. I never did. You know, because I was just married and I wasn't about to go and, you know, tempt fate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I knew it was over there. And also, I had treated most of the guys who had gone over there for diseases that, you know. And so basically, I just kind of hung out. It was, you know, I tried to strike up a conversation with a few of the people, but then, you know, just as soon as you get to know them a little bit, they're taking off for somewhere. Never did run into anybody that was going to the same ship that I was, you know, so it was basically on my own.
Okay. All right. And then once you get to the Kitty Hawk, what do you do there? What's the setup for you?
Okay. I was put in the, you know, I was in the medical department, of course, and at first they wanted to put me at doing medical records. It must have been the glasses or something, you know. I fought that tooth and nail. I just did not want to do medical records. And I did it for a little while, but then I kept on pestering him. I said, I need to do something else. I do not want to do this. You know, I mean, they could have been real bad people about it, but and I says, well, okay, they need help in the lab. So I helped this first class corpsman do all the lab, you know, all the lab work. So you know, that's what I did. And then we also, like when you were standing watch, you would do, you know, like ER kind of stuff down there. Now the first cruise that I was on, was towards the end of the cruise. We had what they call a race riot on board the Kitty Hawk. Essentially, though, what I think it was, now the history books say different. I've looked this up on the cruise books and Wikipedia and everything, and they write about it. And they say it was a race riot. Sure, okay. But, essentially, cruises are supposed to last for about 6-7 months. Well, got to your 6th month, and you get into the Philippines, and you think that you're going home thereafter. You get back on the ship, and as you're pulling out to sea, they says, well, we're going back to the line again. You know, and they did this to us 3 times. So a 6-month cruise turned into an 8 or 9 month cruise. And people were starting to get a little, you know, razzled by that. And so at one point, there was a white guy and a black guy down on the mess deck, and they had a little argument, and they started a fight, and that just then spread through the entire ship. Now that night, I remember being up all night, just sewing people up left and right. We even had one guy who we had to actually transport off the ship. He had gotten beaten around the head, and he had so many head injuries that we were worried about, you know, how he was going to do. And we had, you know, I remember the Marines, you know, rounding everybody up except for the corpsmen who were down there, you know, patching people up on the hangar deck. I mean, they were standing on the airplanes, locked and loaded, you know, trying to calm all this stuff down.
Okay, so it's the naval crewmen on the ship who were fighting each other, and the Marines are sort of the separate group, and then they stay out of the fight.
Yeah, well, basically our Marine detachment was basically in charge of the brig. They were our policemen. So they didn't have any, you know, like I said, maybe some of them had a specialty somewhere that I wasn't aware of, but for the most part, they were the policemen on the ship.
Right. Now, were they both white and black, or was that a mixed
The
race
Marines?
group? Yeah.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah. But the thing is, you know, the Marines are a little tight. I mean, I truly believe the Marines would have, you know, felt that if they'd have done something like that, another Marine would have just shot them, you know. So that would be the end of that.
Okay.
But
And by the time they bring people down for you guys to work on, they no longer care what you look like. They just
No.
want you to patch them up.
no, I sewed white, I sewed black, I sewed Asian, you know, and everything in between, you know. But it was just all night, all night, one right after another.
All right. Now you talked about being on the line. Sort of where are you and what's going on?
We're in the South China Sea. Now I'm not, you know, I very honestly I wasn't aware of where exactly we were at any particular time. My guess it would have been, you know, within 50 to 100 miles of shore. Okay, off of the South Vietnam, and you just had flight ops going on night and day, all night, all day. You know, all day and all night. You just heard this, you know, everybody throughout the whole this whoosh, and then there would be a shudder for everyone that takes off. And then when they land, and they come in and land, there's a bang, and you know, and you hear some chains dragging, and then, you know, and then when the chains are being retrieved, you hear this crackle of the chains being dragged across the deck. But that would happen all night, all day, for days. The longest line period we did was 120 days.
Okay.
Without going into shore.
Now, was this 1972 or?
It was 1972.
Were you there during the Easter Offensive in the spring? Because the North Vietnamese attacked the South in the spring of '72. So there was major fighting going on. Now, American air units were active all through that year. There was a lot of bombing going on.
Oh yeah. Well,
but were you aware of what was going on? Or
I was,
just...
you know, very honestly, probably not. All I was aware of was the fact that I was there. My wife was home. I was, you know, I was doing what I was told to do, and I was hot, and I was, you know, pretty much miserable most of the time. But on the other hand, I did have some close friends, and we, we get together. But I was there. I'm trying to remember. I believe I left in February. I'm sorry, no, April of '72. And we got home, I think, like, almost like in November. And like I said, I got there, the crew had been on this, I didn't mean to say that I had been there for 9 months, but I was there, you know, I came late. But I know what these guys were doing. So, I'm not sure. You know, like I said, we were, there was never a day that we weren't, you know, when we were on the line, that we weren't doing flight ops.
Okay. Now, how common was it for you know, the pilots or flight crew to get injured or have accidents, taking off and landing, that kind of thing?
Actually, more often, one of my first introductions to the Kitty Hawk was just the day before that I got on board ship. One of our guys got sucked up into a jet engine. Not much there you could do, you know. Didn't even have much to send home, you know. We've had other people that would get blown off the deck by jet blast. You know, it's like part of the air crew, or the flight deck crew. We had some that you know I had one time a arresting cable, you know, broke. Lopped this guy's legs clean off, you know, just like a surgical, you know, cut. And the thing is a lot of times if these guys got blown off the deck, especially when if they were doing night ops, most of the time they would not be found. We always had a destroyer escort. They would, you know, when we discovered that somebody had gone overboard, you know, the destroyers would try to, you know, find them. But you got to realize that from the deck to the water is about a 12-story fall, number one. So if the fall doesn't kill you, then you've got this problem with we threw all of our garbage out off the back of the ship, and we had sharks following us all the time. So if if the fall didn't get you, the sharks would. So, we lost several people that way.
Do you know of anyone who did get rescued?
One. But the thing is the guy threw himself overboard on purpose. And he was trying to get when I first met him, he was a really good guy, but then he kind of turned crazy on us. He was trying to get almost like a Section 8, and trying to convince people he was crazy, and so he threw himself overboard. And he was rescued. I mean, I think he did get the Section 8, or worse, but like I said, but no, I don't recall a time that they ever brought anybody, at least down to medical after they had fallen off the ship.
Yeah, okay. Now, when you're on a ship that big, would you notice the weather? I mean, if it was stormy, was that bad?
I was thinking, when we pulled into Subic Bay and then we pulled out for the first time, it says, they have a big announcement that says, prepare to weigh anchor. Meaning they're going to pull the anchor and you're going to take off. So I figured you had to do something. I mean, like sit down and brace yourself or something like that. So I sit down and I brace myself. I'm bracing myself here for an hour. I says, what the heck's going on? So I go up to the hangar deck. We're already out to sea. I never felt anything move. And for the most part, on a ship that big, you never feel movement except in a typhoon. And in a typhoon, you can be going along the deck, walking along the deck, and all of a sudden your next step seems to be about 3 foot lower than what you thought it was going to be. I never got seasick, but a lot of people did during typhoons, but like I said, we went through several typhoons, but that's the only time you felt that move. And like I said, when the planes took off, you could feel the shudder.
All right. Now, how much contact did you have with people back home while you were on the ship?
That was something that my wife and I marvel at. We marveled at in my later service experience. Back then, I wrote a letter to her every day, and she wrote a letter to me every day. But there would be weeks go by that you didn't get mail. And it's just nothing. It could be weather or whatever. A lot of times I would get a stack of letters like about that big, and but I would make sure I looked at the post date, and I would try to read each one in order. She put a little perfume on each one of them. I thought that was pretty nice, and she would do the same. But that's basically it. I tried. I did call her one time on what's called an Audubon line while we were in the Philippines. Essentially, though, it was you had the rotary dial phone. I sat there for 8 hours dialing her number over and over and over again until there was a free line. And finally, when I did get a free line, it was something like 3 o'clock in the morning for her. But that's the only way you could get, so it happened once, during that time. That was it.
All right. Now, if there's such a thing, what would a typical day be like when you're on the ship?
Well, basically, we would have sick call, and depending, like we would work shifts. Sometimes I worked nights, sometimes I worked days. Everybody had to take their turn in the bucket for nights. But basically, you get up. They had a galley going front and aft, forward and aft, all the time, essentially. But I got to the point where I didn't feel like eating much, so I'd go over to the what they call the Guido's bar and buy a Milky Way and a bottle of Coke, and that was my breakfast nearly every morning. And then you do whatever, like set up labs, or draw blood or whatever, or basically, and then you basically just worked all day, and then at around 5, 6 o'clock you'd knock off, but there'd still be people on duty. They did have a closed circuit TV, and they would show movies, every night, and they would have Armed Forces TV, where you learned all the propaganda and all that kind of good stuff. Basically, I smoked a pipe at the time, and I'd just find a place to smoke a pipe and just relax, and I'd write my letters, and then I'd get into my rack, which was about the size of a coffin. It was square, and it was stacked 4 or 5 high. I was on the bottom one, and your lockers, so you're laying across here, your lockers are inside there, and that's your entire living quarters. That's where you sleep, and that's just about all you can do in there, just sleep.
Okay. Now, did you go into port anywhere?
Oh, yeah.
Where would you go?
Well, I went to the Philippines a lot, but the places that we did get to visit were Hong Kong, Singapore, Sasebo, Japan. We went to Mombasa, Africa one time. But that one of the problems that a big ship like that has is that a lot of ports can't accommodate them. Not only from the size of the ship, but they can't accommodate the influx of 5,500 people, all at one time. So as a matter of fact, when we went to Mombasa, Africa, we anchored out in the harbor, and half of us got to go by Liberty boat one day into Mombasa, and then they had to come back, and then the other half went the next day. So if I'd have been on a smaller ship, like a destroyer or something, my brother, who was on a destroyer, he got to go a lot more places than I did. But mostly we saw this with Subic Bay.
All right. So when do you come home from that cruise?
I came back in November, and I'm telling you, I guess I've been away from my wife several times, many times in my life, but coming back is always really, really special. We just, I think that's one of the reasons we're still married today is, we learned at an early age that it was much better to be together than apart, and how much we missed each other when we weren't. Like I said, I was a straight arrow my entire time that I was, on board the Kitty Hawk. I never did what nearly all of the people, including the doctors, were doing, in the Philippines. I treated a lot of them, but that's when my wife was still stationed at Camp Pendleton after that first cruise, and that's when I found out that the ship was going to be going to dry dock up in Bremerton. And I says, geez, I just got back. I don't really want to be away from you for another year and only maybe see you on weekends. So I called Bucca's, the Bureau of Naval Personnel, and asked if there was some way I could, be transferred, and they were very accommodating. They did transfer me to the VF-213, which was at Miramar. It was still in San Diego. It was still maybe a 20-mile drive, but nevertheless, we could stay together that year.
So what was that unit? I mean, VF-213, what's that?
It's an F-4 Phantom Squadron.
The fighter squadron.
Yep.
Okay. And it would normally be on aircraft carriers, but also had a land base?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Well, as a matter of fact, VF-213 was part of the Kitty Hawk's aviation complement. So when the Kitty Hawk went back out, I was there back on the Kitty Hawk with them, because the VF-213 went there.
All right. But in the meantime, you got to stay in Miramar, and so how long was that?
That was a year.
Okay. And was that just kind of regular kind of hospital clinic duty
Yeah,
stuff?
it was just basically clinic. I worked at the clinic and, did the same thing that I was doing, on board ship essentially, or like I was doing at Camp Pendleton. A couple of times, VF-213 went for training exercises elsewhere, and I had to go with them. Like one time was in Fallon, Nevada, which was, I brought Linda along. We had a little Mazda pickup with a little camper on the back, and we camped there, in Fallon, Nevada, for that week while they were doing all that other kind of stuff. So I got checked out for a backseat flight at Miramar because they had the pressure chamber and the ramp that you practice the ejection seat and all this other kind of stuff, and I went through all of that, got checked out for that, but I never ever got a chance to do a backseat ride.
All right. Now, eventually the Kitty Hawk comes out of dry dock, so now you go back on the ship again?
Yep. For a couple of months before we actually set to sea, they had sea trials. So every time they went out to sea trials, I had to go out to sea trials with them. So that was maybe a couple weeks at a time. Then the Kitty Hawk went, went on this tour. A week into the cruise, one of the main engine rooms blew up. It was one of those times where somebody must have been watching over me at that time, because I had worked the night before, so I was sleeping in my rack, and a guy remembered that I was there, came down and woke me up right after this explosion happened, because shortly thereafter the entire ship filled with smoke.
Okay.
Got me out of there. And the rest of that night, we put everybody up on the flight deck. What it did is it knocked out a couple of the screws, the main, the propellers, and the ship actually listed. I think it was to the left, to the port side. The thing looked like a wounded duck. I mean, and that's how we limped into Subic. I treated people for smoke inhalation burns, things like that. And I was running around on the flight deck with an airbag, a resuscitator bag, and we kind of set up a makeshift treatment room in one of the mess decks that wasn't quite as low as what medicine actually was as far as the ship is concerned. But they got it under control, and the next day we were able to move back down, but everything just reeked of smoke. All the walls were black, and we spent most of the rest of the time cleaning up. And we lost, I think it was nine guys in that engine room compartment, right then and there. So the problem with it, one of the things that I always kind of griped about was that, if I had been in country with the Marines or the Army, they were allowed to have beer and stuff like that when they got back. You can't do that on board ship. But it was explained to me. He says, well, that's because, if you go screw up, on land, well, you're going to screw yourself up, probably. You screw up on board ship, and you can screw up the lives of 5,500 people. And so I guess I understood the reason for that.
All right. Now, what were the dates of this tour? So when were you
This
out?
one, I believe I left in November. And actually I spent Christmas in the Philippines. And I got back, well, my tour was going to be, my enlistment was going to be up on June 24th. So I got back at the beginning of, the ship sailed away without me and left me in Subic again. So I was there 2 weeks in Subic again. Now, and I did about the same things I did last time, except this time I had caught some kind of, I don't know whether it was something I ate, but I had almost like having dysentery. I had the most painful diarrhea, and I couldn't eat anything, and for about a week I was just pretty much out of it. You know, if I had everything I could do to just drink water. You know, I never went to the infirmary. You know why?
Why?
You know why? Because I said, I felt, well, if they find really something wrong, they're going to keep me from going home, and I don't really want to do that. So I kept it to myself, but I just really had a horrible, horrible time, you know, during that time. But then just before I was due to leave, I was getting better, and you know, things were looking up. But,
all right. Now that second cruise. Now this is early '73 is when the Peace with Honor thing happens, and so at that point, so you're not doing a lot of airstrikes or things like that. That second tour.
No, we did what they did is they actually sent us to the Indian Ocean for a. They made up a task force to send us to the Indian Ocean, and at that time the only base we had in that area, I think, was Diego Garcia. And so we had to bring along our own supply ships, fuel ships, you know, all this other kind of stuff. But even at that, and that's when we went to Mombasa, by the way, Mombasa, Africa. Oh, and we also had the Shah of Iran on board, and we gave him an air show. We blew up the water for the Shah of Iran, you know, which I thought was just totally ridiculous. But anyway, we ran out of just about everything by the time we got back to Subic. They would serve Kool-Aid with no sugar in it, you know, because they ran out of sugar. You know, I mean, it was just, yeah. And we were getting down to bare minimum, you know. A lot of things we had over and over again, you know, but supplies were just, you know. And that's another thing, it was, resupplying at sea was quite a thing. You know, it was you know, quite a thing to behold. As a matter of fact, you know, when you see two ships going exactly the same speed, things going across by cable, you know, I never saw them spill anything or lose anything. Not that it didn't happen, I'm sure, but you know, and fueling the same way. You know, it was quite an ordeal.
All right. Well, now you're coming down to the end of your enlistment. What were you planning on doing next?
Well, at that point, I was planning on, I was going to go to college at that point. I had no college at that point. I just had a high school diploma. So you got to give my wife credit for having faith in some, you know, in high school graduate when she already was an RN, you know, and an officer, and you know. Thinking that I was going to make something of myself, you know, but so I had applied to several colleges and been accepted by several colleges, and I also so I decided I was going to go up to Lake Superior State College. So I go up there, to try to find a place for Linda and I to live. At that time, I could not find anything where we could live. So while I was up there, I called up Western in Kalamazoo, and I asked them if it was still too late to, you know, say I want to come. They said, no, come on down. So I used all of my Vietnam era GI Bill, every last penny of it, to go to college. And at one point, you know, I told my wife back when I first met her, even before we were married, that someday I was going to be a doctor. She says, yeah, okay. You know. So at one point in my second year of college, I was having such a hard time with chemistry. At one point I was taking something like 17, 18 credits. I got A's, and they were all heavy-duty things. I got A's in everything but a D in chemistry, you know. And I had worked far more on chemistry than any of these other things. Chemistry and I just did not, I had been getting a B, then B minus, then C, and then, the farther along I got, the worse it got. So I decided, well, no medical school is really going to look at me because I've got all of this, because I got a D in chemistry. Now I took it over again and got a B, same one. I think it was organic. And, but I says, well, I've got this blotch on my record. So Western Michigan University at that time started had a physician assistant program. They were the only one in the country at that time, by the way, that offered a bachelor's degree in that. All the other programs were for, and they were all for military, ex-military corpsmen. And most of them offered a diploma or certificate. They were anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Well, Western's was 2 years, and it offered a Bachelor of Science in Medicine. So they had a little house on a corner there near Western. That was their PA house. And I just walked in there. I says, I did 4 years with the Navy as a hospital corpsman. I was wondering whether you guys were taking any applicants. Lady sat me down. We'll fill this out. 2 weeks later, I was in the PA program. So I became a physician assistant 2 years later. And I was up in Sheboygan working as a physician assistant. When I decided I really didn't like working for somebody else. So I applied to medical schools. Now I didn't have any physics. That was a prerequisite. And I knew I didn't have any physics. I was just applying to just let them know I was coming. Lo and behold, Michigan State University College of Osteopathic Medicine was looking to recruit people, especially PAs, that were from the northern parts of Michigan. He says, well, I went down for my interviews, and he says, well, you're accepted if you get the 14 hours of physics in the 3 months that you've got before you matriculate.
Okay.
Quit my job, went to Lake Superior State College. I crossed that bridge 3 times a week. I talked to the physics professor, and we did an individual program. I did my labs at the local high school by myself. I did nothing with physics all summer long. And I got to be in it, but I can't remember a single thing about physics, not a single thing. But I got to be in it. But anyway, that was the other hurdle. And then there's the hurdle of, okay, I have a wife, I have 2 little kids. We had just had another baby, Becky. And, well, it's kind of a funny story. When I got my letter of acceptance, it was a certified letter. I had to go to the mail post office and get it. So I get it, and I'm reading it, and I run home, and my wife was sitting there. She was feeding the baby, and I said, Linda, look at this. And so she looks at it. She just kind of, then she puts it down and kind of looks out into space. And I says to her, Linda, I told you someday I was going to be a doctor. And here it is. I've been accepted to medical school. She says, well, yeah, I know. But I really didn't ever think that you'd get it in. Because I thought you had to be brilliant or something.
Oh, good.
Well, I'm glad you didn't tell me that till now. But anyway. So anyway, I was wondering how I was going to pay for that, because nothing had changed with my parents. Linda's parents lived in New York, or her only living relative was in New York City, and he didn't have any money. I could have gone loans, but so I says, well, I don't want to go on board ship again. So let's look at, I says, how about if we look in the Air Force and see whether we can do that? And they accepted me into their HPSP program, and they not only paid for medical school and all equipment used for that, but they also gave me a little stipend each month, which paid for my rent to live in Spartan Village at Michigan State, which was a little tiny home. Well, I don't know if you've ever been there or not. But,
Well, did your family come with you to live there, or?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, we made it work. I built bunk beds for the kids. and it was a 2-bedroom apartment, but I swear to you, it wasn't too much bigger than this room. It seemed like, a little teeny tiny kitchen, little teeny tiny, living room. Kids loved it because they'd step outside and it was instant kids.
Mm-hmm.
There's kids all over the place. But and then when I did my externship, at that time, you had to choose a base hospital for the last. Also, I finished medical school in 3 years. Mm-hmm. At that time, it was still possible to do that. I never took any vacations, and my main reason, believe it or not, was I figured if I'm going to owe the Air Force time, I want to owe them as little time as I possibly can. So I did it in 3 years, mm-hmm. and I owed them 3 years. We went for externship. We went to Grand Rapids Osteopathic Hospital, and that's where I stayed to do my internship and residency. So I was there for a total of about 5 years, or no, 6 years. I'm sorry.
Okay. Now, during that time, do you have any military obligations?
Yeah, I had to go for some. I could do some rotations with the military, and I did. But they didn't really require it. Now, once you're done with medical school, they no longer pay you. Mm-hmm. Okay, you're deferred, for that training, but they no longer pay you because I figure the hospital is paying you.
Right.
And so you got no more financial support after that, but you're still essentially theirs. If indeed something happened, mm-hmm. and the Navy does this, they'll pull you out of a residency if they need GMOs, general medical officers. Mm-hmm. Air Force wasn't like that. They needed OB-GYNs at the time, so I was golden. But so they, they let me alone pretty much for my residency, and then I had to go. Before I went on active duty, I had to go through MIMSO, which is Military Indoctrination for Medical Service Officers.
Okay, now we had taken your story to the point where you had gone through medical school and internship, residency, and so forth. You're now in the Air Force, and you reported. Now, was this some part of Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio?
I think it was Shepherd.
Okay, Shepherd Field.
Shepherd.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So now down to Texas for your 2 weeks of sort of learning how to be a soldier, which you already knew.
Yeah, I already knew, but this was really like how to be a soldier light.
Yeah.
Basically making sure that your line of buttons, matched the zipper, everything was straight. Called a gig line, mm-hmm. And teaching you military things. I felt very old during that time, mainly because they took all of us into this one room, and this one general was talking to us, and he says, "So, how many Korean veterans do we have here?" Of course, no, there was nobody there. "How many Vietnam veterans do we have here?" Myself and one other guy were the only ones who mm-hmm. stood up. I says, "Wow, all these people are just young kids." Mm-hmm. So I felt, quite mature at that time. When MIMSO was over, they had what's called a dining out, where you got into your mess dress, which is like a tuxedo, and we went out to a fancy restaurant, and I started a conga line and the whole shooting match. It was quite an event. Mm-hmm. And the reason I bring that up is when I got done with Army indoctrination, for medical officers, mm-hmm. we show up in our BDUs, battle dress uniforms, and they give a little talk and they says, "Okay, you guys are done, bye." That's it. That's the difference between the Air Force and the Army.
Yep. All right. So where do they station you now that you're in the Air Force properly?
Well, I had asked for several places, and I think my 20th request was Minot, North Dakota. They tried to say, they actually offered me, to be fair, they offered me England and Germany, But the problem was, I had a dog that I was very fond of, a lab that I hunted with and stuff like that. I really did not want to, in both of those places, I would have had to keep the dog in quarantine for 6 months.
Okay.
You know, so I says, well, I'd just as soon not go overseas, and you know, at this point. And plus, my kids were young. I didn't know how they would take that. So I got Minot, North Dakota. Best duck hunting in the world. But then, what do you do with the other 9 months of the year? You know, you know, that was kind of tough. You know, but I'll tell you, I never ran into more decent, friendly people in my entire life is when I was in North Dakota. The farmers out there, if you stopped and asked them if you could hunt on there, not only would they let you hunt there, they would show you where to get them. You know, and all of the people on that base, you know, we lived on base. We're all kind of one great big happy family. We would all, like if I went on vacation, somebody would, you know, ask for my keys, and they, you know, go in and check on everything. And before I got, the day before I got home, they put some eggs and milk and stuff like that in the refrigerator for me, so we had something when we got back. And we would do the same for other people. But we, it was a very, very busy OB-GYN practice. I did over 250 deliveries every year that I was there.
Wow.
Plus, I did a lot of gyn surgery. A lot of gyn surgery. You know, so it was probably one of the best experience, you know, it's probably the best thing that could happen to me from the standpoint of my practice. Mm-hmm. Because during that 3 years, I didn't have to worry about the finances of a practice. I didn't have to worry about, you know, how to pay my staff. I didn't have to worry about setting up a business, you know, this and that. All I had to worry about was was practicing my trade.
Right.
And I was fortunate enough, at least in my first year, to have a really, really good mentor. You know, second year, she wasn't so good, but you know, the first year I had a really, really good mentor, and he took me under his wing and showed me a lot that I didn't know before, and gave me techniques that I still use today.
Okay. Now, how big a base was it in terms of population?
Oh, good question. It was a SAC base. Yeah. You know, and also, you know, they were in charge of manning all of the missile silos. Mm-hmm. If North Dakota were a country in and of itself, it would be the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. So I think it probably had to be 10, 15,000 at least, probably more. You know, but you know, a lot of people. You know, probably at least equivalent to the population of Minot. Mm-hmm. You know, but. And it was kind of funny. I was there when the Berlin Wall came down. What was so unique about that, I remember commenting on it when I first saw it. We were used to seeing Buffs, B-52s, in the air all the time. You know, there was always B-52s in the air. You know, and tankers and, you know, things like that. Berlin Wall went down. All of a sudden, the skies were empty. No more Buffs. You know, they weren't flying like they were, because they always had to keep, you know, some in the air before that. But the Cold War was over. It was the end of the Cold War. You know, mm-hmm. So you know, that was kind of remarkable. Anyway. Other than that, Minot was just a nice place to raise kids. You know, it was a nice place to be, but we'd have minus 40 degrees on a regular basis around this time of year. Mm-hmm. They would close the schools because not so much that you couldn't drive. There wasn't that much snow. It's just that the kids would get frostbite just as soon as they stepped out of the house. You know, so you know, you learn to live with all that. Mm-hmm. But after being there for 3 years, you know, I actually got to appreciate kind of a stark beauty that North Dakota does have. You have to look for it, and you have to, and it has to grow on you a little bit, but it's there. Mm-hmm. You know.
Okay. Now, at the end of that hitch, was the expectation that you just return to civilian life, or did they make any effort to get you to stay? Okay.
Yeah, they asked me if I would, well, and this was more of a personal matter. The person that they gave me after my first partner left, to be gentle about, was not a very nice person. But she was fair about it. She hated everybody, not just me, But she made life miserable for most everybody who ever came in contact with her. And so when they asked me if I wanted to stay in, I says, well, actually the first year that I was in, if they had asked me to sign on for 4 more years or whatever at that point, I'd have done it in a heartbeat because I was having the time of my life. But she just ruined everything for me, and so they asked me, I says, well, I really don't want to, because I don't want to be stuck with people like this, They said, well, they have those in civilian life too. I says, yeah, but in civilian life you can just quit. I can't just quit the Air Force. And the guy understood because he knew how bad she was too. So yeah, I was going to, I still had to be in the reserve I'm sorry. I had fulfilled all my commitment, but what I didn't realize, because I'd never been an officer before, is that once you're an officer and a gentleman by an act of Congress, you are always an officer and a gentleman by an act of Congress unless you resign your commission. I didn't know that that was an option. So I end up in Grand Haven, starting a brand new practice. It was just me and one other guy. And, I'd been in practice for, maybe 8 months or something like that. Gulf War starts up. And I start getting letters saying, you have to realize that you could be recalled. And I'm saying, oh, geez, that just destroyed this new practice that I'm trying to start. How am I going to do that? And so, I kept on getting these letters, and finally, about a week before everything ended with the Gulf War, it says, this is your last warning letter. The next letter will be a recall. Make sure that your will is in order and all this other kind of good stuff. And I'm saying, holy crap. And so, it's all over with. So I call the people in the Air Force. I says, look, it's just starting to practice. And that would have devastated, you realize the amount of money that I would have lost, and what did it have done to a town like this? Because there was only, at that point, Grand Haven had lost all of its OB-GYNs, and we were the replacements, so we were the only OB-GYNs in town. And, I says, how can I avoid this? Well, sir, you can resign your commission. I said, send me the paperwork. And I resigned my commission, as a major in the Air Force. And so for the next 15, 16, 17 years, something like that, I had nothing to do with the military up until that fatal day. Do you want to know about the fatal day?
Yeah, I do.
The fatal day was, in 2003, I was offered an opportunity to become the residency director for OB-GYN at Metro Hospital in Grand Rapids. I agonized over that for a long time because I really had a nice practice here, but also I had been on call essentially every other night, every other weekend for the last 20 years or so, because that's the way it was in the Air Force, and it never changed when I was here. So, it was starting to take its toll, and going to Metro would have been, much nicer. And I finally decided to go ahead and do that, rather than die, die here. So I had some time off, which I never had. I'd never had any time off. And we had all this time off, and my wife says to me, you know, there's a Muskegon air show. I think we should go. I look at her and I say, Linda, we were in the Air Force. We saw air shows. Why in the world would I want to go and see an air show? She says, well, because we've lived here all this time and we've never seen it. And I says, okay, we'll go to an air show. So we go to this air show. They had the Blue Angels flying and all this military stuff all over the place. And I had a twang about 9/11. I mean, I was still a little miffed about all of that. And we're going along here, and they have an actual Army Reserve medical unit in Walker, and they had a tent set up. So we're walking along the Broadway there, and I'm holding her hand, and I squeeze her hand a little tighter, and I says, you know, Linda, sometimes I wish I wasn't such a boy. She says, why is that? I says, because this stuff is exciting the hell right out of me. 2 weeks later, I joined the Army Reserve, joined the Walker unit, and that's when I did their Army indoctrination and some of their other stuff. But it's the one branch of the service I actually hadn't been in. I was in, by the way, 1 year of Army Reserve in Kalamazoo when I was in undergrad. They had a thing, try it for a year.
Right.
And I tried it for a year. Never went anyplace, never did anything, just, basically went to meetings, and that was it. But, this is the first time I'd ever been, actually with the Army. And like I said, it was quite a culture shock compared to the Air Force. I consider the Air Force the gentleman's service, but the Army is where the nitty-gritty, where the rubber meets the road. Down at this training, we were out in tents for a week without a shower or whatever, doing all kinds of things at night navigation, all this other kind of stuff. And I had to admit, it was kind of exciting to me, Well, my first mobilization with the Army Reserve was in 2005, and that was to Fort Lewis out in Washington. And I no sooner get there and they tell me, well, sir, we're really, really sorry, but we need somebody to backfill up at Fort Wainwright in Fairbanks, Alaska. Little did they know, I'd have given my left arm to go to Alaska, especially for 6 weeks, in the middle of the summer. And they were apologizing to me. I says, well, no, don't apologize. I'm fine with it. I'll tough it out. So I found myself up in Fort Wainwright, Alaska for 6 weeks. I had the time of my life. It was just, I did some fishing up there. I mean, I would drive 5 hours to the Clatina River, fly fish for red salmon, get my limit in an hour, and then drive 5 hours back. It was just, just an amazing thing. So that was my, and then I really didn't even want to go back to Fort Lewis, but I had 2 more weeks to do, so I had to go back to Fort Lewis. But that was my first move, and I was getting kind of discouraged, essentially, I kind of wanted, I felt I had something to offer in a war zone, mainly because of my age, and because I was a doctor, and I could, and although not a general surgeon, I was still a surgeon, but the next time came around, and it was to Camp Bucca in 2006. That was actually in the southern part of Iraq. You could see the ocean from Camp Bucca. And as I may have told you earlier, I was what was called an IMA. I really wasn't attached to anybody. I was an individual mobilization augmentee. So every place I went from that first time on was as an IMA. So the people that I was working with, the very first time I would meet them would be when I arrived. That would be it. So Camp Bucca, I worked as in the ER. And I worked mostly nights in the ER. But then they needed somebody to go along with them on detainee transfers. And I says, and this was my unit, this was the unit I was attached to. I says, what? You know, essentially the times that they were going were the nights that I was supposed to be off. So the entire time I was at Bucca, I never had a day off. I would work my ER, and then the next time I would go on these convoys. Now with these convoys, you got to know what grunt life is like. You know, essentially I'm walking across the desert to their unit, 120, 130 degrees, temperature. I have a backpack, full of medical gear, plus all my battle rattle on, the body armor and Kevlar and all this stuff. And you could, if it's a windy day, you can't even open your hands because it's kind of like putting a hairdryer to your hands. It would burn your hands, the wind was so hot. And so you're trudging across the desert over there, and then you get everybody all rounded up. Now the prisoners that were coming from Bucca to Baghdad were happy prisoners, mainly because they were going to be closing Abu Ghraib because of all of the bad press. So the ones that we were transferring up there were happy prisoners. When we were transporting back, they weren't so happy because they thought they were going to get out. Now they're not. But anyway, so we get into a convoy. And we do this at nighttime. And I had to wear knee pads because in the Humvee that I was riding, the metal doors got so hot, it would burn your knees if you kind of let them rest along the side. And you can't have a window open because of IED risk. The windows are about that thick, to try to protect you from all that. So every time you go under a bridge, everybody stops. Guys go out, look above the bridge, below the bridge, and everything, and then they shoot off a flare if it's to illuminate the area, and you drive through. Then we go to Basra, which is a British base, and that's where we catch the C-130s, the airplanes. We load the passengers up, and you're sitting on the runway in the dark at 120 degrees. Just waiting, wondering when you're going to be, getting the hell out of there. You still have all your battle rattle. And C-130s have no air conditioning. The only air conditioning they have is when they get up to a certain altitude. It's cooler up there, and that's when it gets cool. Sweating your butt off, and the smell of people is just, kind of overwhelming. Finally, you get to take off, and couple of times, had some exciting times. One time, we had one of our engines just stop. So we had to find an emergency landing to another base, and then transfer everybody over to another plane. Then another time, we were taking off from Baghdad, and the plane all of a sudden just kind of goes up like this, it goes down like that, it goes down like that, and you see all this red stuff coming out of the plane, pop, 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 all over the place. And I had no idea what it was. I was pretty naive. I had no idea what that was. I thought, well, maybe we had a problem with an engine again. But then all of a sudden it just kind of... So when we landed, I went out to the pilot. I says, what the hell went on back there? Oh, that. He says, yeah, we were locked on by a missile. Those were the flares that we do to, decoys, and we did some evasive maneuvers. But it didn't get us. I said, Wow.
Thanks.
I'm glad you didn't tell me that till now, you know. But, and then another time, we had just gotten back to Basra, and we were loading up our unhappy prisoners. And all of a sudden we start getting mortared. You know, I have a medic, you know, problem is, more than likely, if it hadn't been for the fact that we had the medical truck there, those guys could have, you know, taken off. But the medical Humvee is, it's a 4-liter ambulance, is the slowest truck in the whole thing. So the speed in which you can get the hell out of there is dependent on that.
Mm-hmm.
So instead, they circled the wagons. And I'm telling you, I was never so proud of the guys that I was with. I mean, goodness sakes. They were, for the most part, they were a bunch of crazy kids. But they morphed that night into something to behold. I knew that that we were going to be okay. They were outside. They were shooting off into the desert. They were, you know, they were just totally different people. And I was looking at my, you know, my medic that was driving the truck. And at that time, there had been all of these things, incidents where people were getting their heads cut off and shown in the videos and stuff like that. And I says, what? I forget what his name was, but I says, what do you feel about getting captured? He says, not much, sir. I says, neither do I. So if we're, rather than get captured, we're just going to fight until we die, right? He says, yeah. Yeah. And fortunately, we never had to get to that. But neither of us wanted to put any of our family through something like that. I mean, that was just, you know, going to die, just die. Right?
You were mentioning, you talked about just the regular, when you're, as a doctor at Bucca, you doing operations, and did you have combat casualties or ID, or were these accidents, or people who got sick, or what did you have?
We didn't have too many at Bucca. Now, a couple of times we had a few prison, you know, Bucca was a big detainee center. And actually, shortly after I got there, they had a riot. And the guys went in. Now here's another thing about the control our troops had. You know, self-control. They went in there with a Humvee. Well, they got overwhelmed. Our guys got overwhelmed, and they set the Humvee on fire. They're in the prison compound. And basically, they just had rubber bullets. But then the commanders, you know, seeing the situation deteriorating, said, you can start to use live ammo now. But you know what? The guys didn't, because they felt they could control it without it. And they were right. They did. They did control it without killing anybody. But a lot of times, we would have to take care of detainees as well as our own. Tikrit was different, you know, but here, you know, a lot of the stuff, you know, detainees would kind of fake things too. And so you had a lot of fake stuff, you know, but in that area, you didn't have a whole lot of actual combat ops going on. The closest thing you had was these convoys that
right.
You know, so.
Okay. And now that was your
First tour.
that's your first tour. Okay, so you get to, how long were you in Iraq at that point?
I was there for 4 months.
Okay.
What they do, what the Army's position on that, especially with reservists, is that they don't want you to lose your skills, and you can. You know, you can lose your skills if you're there, because you aren't. I mean, I definitely wasn't doing any OB, and I definitely wasn't doing any gen surgery. You know, and so they only want you there for 4 months at a shot. So, and so I went so in 2008 I went to Tikrit, and that was Saddam Hussein's Air Force Academy. You know, and we actually had a nice track. You could go and run the track. and except all the walls had bullet holes and everything around it. I stayed in a barracks, that was an old Iraqi Air Force barracks, but my bunk was built over their latrine. It was basically plywood. Nothing really fancy at all. There, I was attached to a medical unit that was, we had the tent hospital. I think it was a 327th medical brigade or something like that. Anyway, we there I worked in sick call. I also assisted in surgery. I never went on any convoys there, although being rocketed, on base was pretty common. They were poor shots, but we got rocketed several times. Now we had a lot of, there you had injuries of, our soldiers, from combat ops, and you had Iraqi civilians. One night we had a mass cal that was, we treated a lot of civilians in the mass cal. Yeah, there I felt I did a lot. There was this one Iraqi woman who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And she was pretty shot up. And we didn't know whether she would survive the surgery, so we wanted to do everything that needed to be done all at once. So one guy was trying to take care of a bleeder up in the axilla, another one was taking care of a problem in the leg, another one was doing the abdomen, and then he asked me if I wanted to do a mastectomy. I says, well, I haven't done one, but I've seen plenty of them. I probably could do it. You just let me know if I'm doing it wrong. So I was doing, because she had shrapnel in the breast, and she was, it was all infected, and so I didn't want to take any chances with more infection. So I did my first mastectomy there. Came out just fine. Like I said, I'm a fairly good surgeon. I learn real quick, but it was one of those things where she actually pulled through this and she lived. So.
Now these Iraqi civilian casualties, was that from our fire, or were they just caught in the middle of something, or do you not know?
You probably don't know. You probably don't know. It could have been either.
Now, did you have much contact with the Iraqis aside from the detainees or casualties?
We had interpreters that were Iraqi, and you'd learn something about their culture. Now, generally, the Tikrit had several countries represented, on that base. Matter of fact, one time we went over to the Turkish. We went and had dinner with the Turks, and it was quite an interesting evening. And learned a little bit about those guys, and ate their food, and it was pretty good. A lot of paprika in that stuff. But other than that, we weren't allowed to go out into the out of the wire. As a matter of fact, when I did these convoys, that's the only you always carried a weapon. Whether you were on base or whether you weren't, you always had to have a weapon with you. And mine was just for self-defense. Mine was not tactical. So I had a 9mm. But that was the only time, was when I went off base with the convoys, just outside of the base. Then you would lock and load. That's the only time you had it loaded. You had a gun and it had 2 clips that were full, but you didn't have the clip in the gun. On base. But then you had so you learned to really, it got to be just a pain in the ass to carry that thing around all the time. But where were we?
Well, we're just basically talking about sort of the second tour and what was going on there,
yeah.
and what you were saying
And
originally.
And the other thing that was kind of interesting is that you had to, it was kind of like MASH. You knew it was going to be a bad night because you could hear the helicopters coming in. And so I had my own, matter of fact, at Tikrit, the other thing I had is when we had mass cows, I had my own ER bay. When I was putting in chest tubes, I hadn't put in a chest tube since I was an intern. When I was putting in chest tubes, I was doing central lines, this and that, things that I hadn't been doing, like forever. But it all comes back to you pretty quick. The other thing is, I was telling you that every time I went someplace, I was by myself. So the formula was the same every place I went. I would, since I didn't know anybody, when nothing was going on, I'd sit outside in my hooch. I'd have a box of cigars with me. I'd light one up and just sit there and wait for whoever comes by. And inevitably, because of my rank, they almost had to say something to me. And they'd say something, "Wow, that smells pretty good, sir." I says, "Have one, have a seat." It started out with maybe one or two people, sitting with me. By the time I was done, I'd have 20 or 30, and it was kind of interesting. One night, in Tikrit, when I was telling you we had a pretty bad mass cow one night, and we lost quite a few of our own guys, and everybody was just bummed. I was still working in the ER and everything, and I go, finally things calmed down. I go back to my hooch, and here's everybody sitting around my place waiting for me to come with a cigar. And the thing is, we all lit up. I hardly said a word, and it was okay. We were all just, we were tired. We were hurting because of what we'd just seen, and nobody had to say a word. We just sat there smoking cigars. It was okay, but we felt comfortable in that.
Right. Now, is this the period when the surge was going on? There was more activity on the ground, or do you not really pay attention?
I can't remember. This was a surge in 2008.
I think that's about right.
Yeah, it could have been.
So it started a little bit earlier, but around in that period. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, it could have been.
Because we had a lot of people deployed out in the community, and they would get into fights and things, and so there were more casualties for a while, and then they died down as it was successful.
Mm-hmm. Well, we had pretty well controlled Tikrit at that point. Broke my heart here not too long ago when they said Tikrit had fallen to ISIS. So I'm saying, my God, we lost a lot of people trying to get that place, and what do? We give it back to them, and drives me up the wall.
All right. Now, are there other things from that second tour that kind of stand out in your memory that you haven't brought into the story yet?
Not anything, I just look at that time as, each place is unique in and of itself. I made probably some closer friends, there, and some people I actually keep in touch with even today. But aside from those, the mass cows that we had, quite a few times,
Now, you use that term, mass cows, that mass casualties,
Yeah.
or large numbers of
Yeah,
casualties?
mass casualty.
Okay.
And basically, I think you could define anything, mass casualty as anything more than 5, And so we had quite a few. Now, well, the other thing I did, every place I went, both Bucca, Tikrit, and Afghanistan, was, I happen to be Catholic, and I play guitar masses for our church, once a month. So I would borrow a guitar from Special Services. I never took one of my own over there. And I would play, if they, I'd ask them if they needed any music, and always they did. And, at Bucca, I did the guitar mass by myself, every week whenever I was available. In Tikrit, not only did I do it every week, I'd do it, for all of the masses if I was there. And I had a choir, that we worked in. And I did the same thing now in Afghanistan. One of my traveling partners was the Catholic priest, because his downtrace units were the same as mine. So we traveled together, and I'd bring the guitar, and I'd always play his mass for him, when he did it, So, I mean, generally, some of these guys wouldn't have a Catholic mass for over, they figure the Army's minimum standard is to have one Catholic mass every 60 days. Sometimes they wouldn't even get that. So, like I said, that's neither here nor there, but that's one of the things I did.
Sure. All right. So was this Tikrit another 4-month stint? Was that like the first one? Yeah. Okay. Now, while you were in Iraq, was it easier now to communicate with home? Could you easily complain?
Yeah. That was the thing. My wife and I just were marveled at the standpoint that, when I was in Bucca, we could email to each other instantaneously. I says, this is wonderful. When I was at Tikrit, though, we could Skype. We learned how to Skype, and we were doing the Skyping, and I could actually see her every day. And same with Afghanistan, I could see her every day. A lot of times, like, we'd have a little bit of I could never tell. First of all, I never told her that I was doing the convoys.
Yeah.
Until they were over. Mm-hmm. And then when I was in Afghanistan, which I'll talk about later, I did a lot of traveling. I couldn't tell her where I was going. You couldn't put that stuff out. I just say, I won't be able to. I won't be able to talk to you tomorrow. And then she knew I was going to be going somewhere. Anyway, it was so much better than Vietnam. Jeez. Yeah. Although I miss the perfume letters, I really do.
Yeah. All right. So now 2008, and then you go back. Now, were you still working for Metro at this point? Was that still your job? Or?
Actually, I worked for Metro from 2003 till 2008, 5 years. They didn't. The problem I had with working at Metro was that I had to drive. There was no way I wanted to live in Grand Rapids. Once you've lived in this area, and I'm sure anywhere, I mean, home is home for you. But once, I've been living in Grand Haven, Spring Lake area, there's no way I wanted to move to Grand Rapids. But I also got really, really, really tired of the drive. Mm-hmm. So, I started thinking about that. And I was also trying at Metro at that time to start what's called a laborist program, where you have a board-certified OB-GYN doc on the OB floor 24/7, to cover anything that's not covered, to cover the residents' clinic deliveries, to do all that. Well, they had strung me along for a little while, and then at one point they said, well, we aren't going to do it. Along comes Mercy, and they said, we're looking for somebody to start a laborist program. So that entire time I was in Tikrit, I agonized over that as to what to do. And actually, before I was done, I told Metro that I wasn't coming back, that I was going to accept the offer at Mercy, much shorter drive. Also, we did, and they came through with a promise. They let me start the laborist program, and that's what I do now.
Okay. All right. But in the meantime, you're still in the Army Reserve,
Yes.
and there are still things going on. Iraq winds down to a degree with withdrawal, but we still stay in Afghanistan. So
Yeah.
when do you go to Afghanistan?
Well, in between Iraq and Afghanistan, I was at Fort Drum I was mobilized to Fort Drum for 4 months, which was kind of fun. Their hospital is downtown. It's not on the base.
And what city is that?
Watertown, rather, New York. But it was kind of a fun, thing. And my wife came out and visited me. We saw the St. Lawrence Seaway and all that again. But then, I went to Afghanistan as the command surgeon for the 865th Expeditionary Sustainment Command. Now, they were in charge of supplying, a large swath. I mean, they coordinated most of the convoys that went, that brought supplies, to every base. And because they had such a big swath, most of these bases, because I was the command surgeon, I had to go and check on all of these, downtrace units to make sure that they had everything they needed. So I didn't do a lot of medicine per se there. I did more of an administrative role. So every week I was flying, driving, convoying, helicoptering, to a different place. I remember one night we were taking a helicopter up to, I think, Camp Wolverine, and we were waiting for the helicopter. It comes around about midnight. We get on, and this bunch of special ops guys comes on with all of their equipment. I think they were Green Beret types, and so we just basically we're all squished in there like sardines, and we just barely get off the ground. Turn off all the lights, and we don't get much further than just off the ground. We're flying low the entire time, in the dark. I have no idea where we are, where we're going. That was kind of interesting. They got us there that night, but I kept on wondering what was going to be happening with all of this. But fortunately, we got there okay. On the way back from there, we went in the daylight. And, the priest was sitting next to me, and I could see that the door gunner, he was getting ready to, and I don't think he knew this, but usually the door gunners will fire, once they're out in a safe place, they'll fire a couple times to make sure that everything's going on, was working. And I saw the guy doing this, and I thought the priest did too. The guy lets off a couple of rounds, the priest nearly hits the ceiling. And he claims that I was the one who was scared. But anyway, the rocket attacks in Kandahar were a daily occurrence. They got to the point, and sometimes they, and these did hit their mark. They killed a few people, quite often. But they would have this. She had a British accent. It was a recorded message. All of a sudden you hear, rocket attack, rocket attack, and then and the thing of it is the first time I heard that, I did exactly what I was supposed to. I ran into one of the bunkers. Second time I did, I ran into the bunker. Third time I ran into the bunker. Finally, I figured it out. By the time you hear rocket and you haven't been hit yet, you're okay. Because by the time they do that, the rocket's already hit. So, it was kind of I just stayed in bed, whenever that happened. And I really thought in Kandahar that my being a colonel and everything, that maybe they'd upgrade my quarters just a little bit. Actually, it was the worst accommodations that I had in the entire time that I had been out, overseas. There were 5 colonels, as a matter of fact, sharing the same little room. And I had my little section of the room. But even that, I had to wait for something like a week for the other guy that I was replacing to get the hell out of there so I could have it. So I kind of hot bunked it for a week. Any place that had an empty bunk, I'd throw my bag out and that's where I slept. Anyway, that was Kandahar.
Now, did you see any more of the Afghans than you had of the Iraqis?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we did. The priest that I traveled with, he was quite outgoing. And matter of fact, like on some of the outposts, the forward operating bases, they actually had some of the Afghan tribal leaders who would come in there. And they offered me some food one time. I just didn't know what to do with it, but the priest saved my bacon by explaining to them that I had stomach issues. I just didn't know where that came from. Anyway, yeah, you got to know a little bit more about the Afghanis there, and also they would have a bazaar in Kandahar, where all these Afghanis would bring all the things they're trying to sell you. Actually, I got some nice rugs, so that was a big thing, is getting some nice Persian rugs, for a good price. And they're almost disappointed if you don't haggle with them, so you have to haggle with them just a little bit. Yeah, you got to know a little bit more about that. And then some of the places I went to, like in the mountains of blanket on the name.
Okay.
Anyway, we travel up to one of the bases. The mountainous areas were just beautiful. I mean, they were snow-capped and it was cool up there.
Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, when I arrived in Kandahar, I arrived in February. And I was downright cold for a month. I mean, it was raining, it was cold. But then we had, the very next day it became summer. Somewhere in March. And all of a sudden it was like 100 and some degrees, just like that. But anyway, that was Afghanistan. I think too.
Okay. Now, how long was that tour? Was that another 4 months?
4 months.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then, did you eventually get out of the Army Reserve, or did they retire you out?
Well, I was retired at that point. I didn't realize when I first joined the Army Reserve, I had no intention of getting a retirement, because I really didn't think that that time, like I was telling you, when I joined the Air Force, I didn't think they counted that time in medical school until you got a in residency internship. When I joined the Army Reserve, they says, well, sir, you've got 16 years of active duty. I says, no, you need to recheck that. And I actually sent it back to them. I said, you recheck that, because I told him the reason. And he says, well, no, they counted that. They counted that as active duty. And they went and redid it, and they said, you got 16 years of active duty. So, when I stayed in the Army Reserve till I was 60 years old, and that was in November of 2012. So I retired in November 15th of 2012. With 16 years of active duty and all the points that I had for that, on a colonel, at the rank of colonel, and that's the other thing. If I'd have retired any sooner than I could have taken an early retirement, but if I had retired any sooner than that, it would have been as a lieutenant colonel, not as a colonel. But that wasn't the only reason. I mean, there's parts of it I still miss, and I mean, it would not be the end of the world for me if all of a sudden they decided to call me back.
Mm-hmm.
For every service that I was in, it was the right place to be at the right time. The Navy was the right place for me to be when I was 17 years old till the time I was 22. You know, I got all the adventure that I ever wanted. I met the love of my life. You know, I formulated what I was going to do with my life. The Air Force was the exact place I needed to be at that time in my life. With a wife and 2 kids, didn't want to go a lot of places, wanted to have, you know, raise a family, learn how to do my trade, you know, my chosen profession. And then the Army was absolutely the right place for me to be at that time because, you know, when you're just re-entering the service at age 50, you're kind of wondering how worthwhile you can still be. And I found out I could be still worthwhile. And like I said, it wasn't my intention to have a retirement, but I got it, and I'm grateful for it. And like I said, if the Army decided to take me back, and they could actually, they could take me back till I'm about 75.
Okay. Well, I hope they don't really have occasion to.
Yeah, that's my hope too. But like I said, it certainly wouldn't hurt my feelings if they did. You know.
All right. It makes for a pretty remarkable story, so thanks for coming in and sharing it today.
Well, I appreciate you doing that. Thank you.